She arrived at his gates with two starving children, mud on her boots, and nothing left to lose. He was a man who hadn't smiled in 3 years. The town called her desperate. They called him broken. Nobody believed anything good could come from letting her through that gate. They were wrong. But before this story ends with a wedding under cottonwood trees and fireflies dancing through golden fields, it nearly ends with a woman hitching horses alone in a midnight storm, choosing to disappear forever rather than destroy the only man who ever treated her like she mattered. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay until the very last word. Trust me, you need to hear how this ends. The mud was the worst part. Not the cold, though the cold was bad enough, the kind that crept through wool and settled into your bones like it intended to stay permanently. Not the hunger either, though Evelyn Mercer had been managing hunger for so long, it had become something like a companion, something she'd learned to bargain with and occasionally ignore. Not even the shame, which walked beside her like a shadow she couldn't outrun no matter how fast she moved or how far she traveled. No, the worst part was the mud. It grabbed at her boot heels with every step, thick and black and stubborn, the kind of Montana mud that formed after 3 days of freezing rain and seemed almost personally offended by human movement. Evelyn had wrapped the children in every blanket she owned, and still Noah's lips had gone slightly blue around the edges an hour ago. She'd been watching those lips obsessively ever since, glancing back at the wagon every 30 seconds, counting the color like a woman counting coins she couldn't afford to lose. Lily sat upright in the wagon bed, 7 years old, and already carrying the particular expression of a child who has learned not to ask questions. She held her little brother close with both arms wrapped around his shoulders. She hadn't complained once in 4 hours of travel. Not about the cold, not about the empty stomach, not about the fact that their mother had been crying silently for most of the morning and pretending she wasn't. Evelyn wiped her face with the back of her wrist and kept walking. The entrance to Blackwood Ranch appeared through the freezing mist like something out of a story she didn't quite believe. 2 massive timber posts supporting a crossbeam with the ranch's name burned deep into the wood, the letters thick and deliberate, the kind of lettering a man puts on something he intends to last. Beyond the gate, a road of packed earth and gravel curved gently toward a main house that sat dark and square against the pale winter sky, smoke rising from one chimney, a single lamp burning in a downstairs window. Evelyn stopped walking. She stood there for a long moment, the wind cutting across the open land with nothing to slow it down. And she looked at that lamp in the window and felt something move in her chest that she immediately tried to press back down. Hope was a dangerous thing when you had children depending on you. Hope made you miscalculate. She'd miscalculated before. "Mama?" Lily's voice was small but steady behind her. "Is this it?" "This is it." "What if he says no?" Evelyn didn't answer right away. She looked at the gate, at the dark house, at the smoke curling from that chimney into the gray Montana sky. Then she reached into her coat pocket and closed her fingers around the silver ring, her husband's, plain and worn smooth from 20 years of hard work, and she held it the way other women held crosses. "Then we figure out something else," she said. "Same as always." She pushed the gate open herself. It swung on well-oiled hinges, which told her something. A man who oiled his gates in the dead of winter was a man who paid attention to his property. That could mean pride. That could mean discipline. She was about to find out whether it meant anything useful. The knock on the front door of Blackwood Ranch's main house was harder than Evelyn intended. She'd planned something measured, something dignified. A widow showing up to ask for work was already at a disadvantage. Too much desperation in her posture, and the man across from her would think she was a burden. Too much pride, and he'd think she was ungrateful for the opportunity. She'd spent the last 2 miles of walking rehearsing the exact right tone. Then her knuckles hit the wood and it came out hard and sharp. The knock of someone who had been cold for 3 days and had run completely out of measured. Silence from inside. Then boots on a hardwood floor, slow and deliberate. The walk of a big man who wasn't startled by knocking at his door, but wasn't particularly delighted by it either. The door opened. Cole Bennett was not what she expected. She'd heard his name in town. 3 different people in Red Hollow had mentioned Blackwood Ranch when she'd asked around for work, and 2 of them had described the owner in terms that made him sound like a mountain that had somehow learned to sign contracts and manage cattle. The third person, an old woman running a dry goods store, had just looked at Evelyn for a long moment and said, "He lost his family a few years back. Hard man now. Probably won't help you." Standing in the doorway, Cole Bennett was tall. That part was accurate, with the kind of build that came from actual physical labor rather than any vanity about it. His hair was dark and needed cutting. His jaw carried 3 or 4 days of growth. He was wearing a flannel shirt with a tear along one shoulder seam that hadn't been repaired, and his expression when he looked at Evelyn was not hostile exactly, but it was the expression of a man who had learned to expect that people knocking on his door usually wanted something he wasn't prepared to give. His eyes went from Evelyn to the wagon behind her in approximately 2 seconds. He saw the children before she said a single word. Something shifted in his face. Not softness exactly, more like a crack in a wall, a hairline fracture, the kind of thing you might miss if you weren't watching carefully. Evelyn was watching carefully. "I'm not here to ask for charity," she said before he could speak. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was a small victory. "My name is Evelyn Mercer. I'm a widow. I have 2 children and I have skills: accounting, literacy, organizational work. I can manage books, I can keep house, I can teach. I'm told you run a large operation here, and I'm asking for an opportunity to earn work, not receive it." Cole said nothing. The wind pushed between them. "I can show you references," she added, "from my late husband's business associates in— How long since they ate?" His voice was lower than she expected, rougher, the voice of a man who spent more time outdoors than in conversation. Evelyn hesitated. "I'm sorry?" "The children." He nodded toward the wagon. "How long since they had a proper meal?" The question caught her completely off guard. She had prepared for suspicion, for dismissal, for a door closing in her face. She had not prepared for that question, and the simple directness of it, the fact that it was the first thing out of his mouth, hit her somewhere she hadn't expected to be hit. "Yesterday morning," she said. "I fed them what I had yesterday morning." Cole looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then he stepped back from the doorway. "Bring them in," he said. "Tashesam." He was already moving toward the kitchen before Evelyn turned back to the wagon. She lifted Noah out of the wagon bed first. He was 5 years old and had been asleep for the last hour, and he woke confused and shivering, his small hands grabbing at her coat. And when she turned back toward the house with her son in her arms, she found Cole Bennett standing on the porch steps. "Give him here," he said. "I can carry—" "Your hands are shaking." He wasn't being cruel about it. He was just stating a fact. "Give him here and get your daughter." Evelyn looked at this man she had met approximately 90 seconds ago, this stranger standing on the porch steps of his house in the freezing Montana dark, and something in her chest was doing a complicated thing she didn't have time to examine. She transferred Noah into Cole's arms. Her son didn't wake up. He just shifted, grabbed a fistful of Cole's flannel shirt in one small hand, and settled his head against a chest that was broad enough to serve as a reasonable substitute for a pillow. Cole looked down at the boy for exactly 1 second before he turned and carried him inside. Evelyn stood in the cold for a moment longer than she should have. Then she went back for Lily. The kitchen at Blackwood Ranch was large and smelled like wood smoke and something that had been simmering on the stove for hours. A rough-hewn table dominated the center of the room, long enough to seat 12, scarred from years of use. The walls were plain, undecorated. There were no curtains on the window above the dry sink. Cole had set Noah on a bench near the stove and wrapped a heavy blanket around him before Evelyn and Lily came through the door. Noah was awake now, blinking in the warmth, looking at the strange kitchen with the unfocused wonder of a 5-year-old who has just discovered heat after days without it. "Sit," Cole said to Lily, pulling out a chair. Lily looked at her mother. Evelyn nodded. Lily sat. She folded her hands on the table with a formality that would have been heartbreaking under any other circumstances. Cole moved to the stove without ceremony. He ladled soup, thick, real soup with potatoes and what smelled like venison, into 2 bowls and set them in front of the children. He put bread beside each bowl. He did it with the efficiency of someone who did not think of himself as doing anything remarkable, which somehow made it harder to watch. Evelyn stood near the door. "Sit down," he said, without looking up. "I'll get another bowl." "I don't need—" "You haven't eaten either." He turned and looked at her directly for the first time since opening the door, and his eyes were dark and direct and patient in the way that people are patient when they are accustomed to being around animals and children and weather. Things that cannot be argued with, only waited out. "Sit down, Mrs. Mercer." Evelyn sat down. She watched her children eat. She watched Noah grab his spoon with both hands and lower his face close to the bowl with the unself-conscious urgency of a child who had stopped worrying about table manners approximately 48 hours ago. She watched Lily eating carefully, deliberately, the way Lily did everything, as if she were preserving her dignity against circumstances that kept trying to strip it away. When Cole set a bowl in front of Evelyn, she looked at it for a moment before she could bring herself to pick up the spoon. "Thank you," she said. "I intend to earn this." Cole sat down across from her with his own bowl. He looked at her steadily. "You said you could manage books. My husband ran a trading operation in Wyoming for 11 years. I maintained every record, managed vendor contracts, identified 2 separate accounting frauds that saved the business approximately $800 over the course of 3 years. She paused. "I'm not exaggerating those numbers." "I didn't think you were." He picked up his spoon. "What happened to the trading operation?" It wasn't quite a question, more like an invitation. "He died," Evelyn said. 18 months ago. Pneumonia. The business had debts I didn't know about. He'd borrowed against it during a bad season without telling me. By the time I understood the situation, the creditors had already moved. She said it plainly, without self-pity, because she told the story enough times now that the rawest part of the grief had been worn down into something she could carry without showing. "I sold everything I could and kept my children fed. Then I ran out of things to sell." Cole ate his soup. He didn't offer sympathies or condolences, which Evelyn found she appreciated. Sympathy from strangers had a way of making her feel worse, not better, as if the pity confirmed the hopelessness of the situation rather than addressing it. "The ranch has problems," he said after a moment. "What kind of problems?" He looked up. One corner of his mouth shifted slightly. Not quite amusement, more like assessment. Like she'd passed something without knowing she was being tested. "The books are a mess," he said. 3 different hands have kept them over the last 2 years, none of them consistently. I've been losing money on the cattle end for 6 months, and I can't tell whether it's the market, a management problem, or theft. Those are 3 very different problems with 3 very different solutions. Yes, they are. Which do you suspect? Theft, he said, but I can't prove it without someone who can read the records and tell me where the numbers stop making sense. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. I can do that. I know. He looked at her steadily. That's why you're sitting here instead of standing in the cold. She did not sleep well that first night. Cole had given them a room, 2 beds, a wash basin, a small wood stove that he'd stoked himself before showing Evelyn the latch on the door, with the particular deliberateness of a man communicating something without saying it directly. You control who comes in here. That's your space. She had understood him perfectly. The children fell asleep almost immediately. Noah curled against Lily with the boneless abandon of a boy who had finally run out of fear for the night. Lily with one hand resting on her brother's back, even in sleep, protective, even unconscious. Evelyn lay on her own bed and looked at the ceiling and listened to the Montana wind throw itself against the house. She thought about her husband. James Mercer had been a good man. She believed that completely. And yet he had kept the worst of the business troubles from her for reasons she still wasn't sure whether to call love or condescension or simple fear of her reaction. She had spent 18 months alternating between grief and a furious, private anger she had no clean place to put, because he was dead, and you couldn't be angry at someone who was dead. People told her that implicitly with every look they gave her when she stopped crying for a day. But she was. She was angry. She had loved him, and she was angry at him, and both things were true at the same time. And lying in this strange room in a stranger's house with her children finally warm and fed, she let herself feel both things without trying to manage either one. Then she thought about the man downstairs. Stop that, she told herself, with the efficiency of a woman who had survived a year and a half by refusing to be stupid. Stop that right now. She turned on her side and watched the wood stove and listened to the house settle around her, and eventually, somewhere in the small hours of the morning, she slept. The ranch books were even worse than Cole had described. Evelyn spent her first full day at Blackwood Ranch at the desk in the ranch office, a room off the main hallway that smelled of leather and old tobacco and neglect. With 3 years of ledgers spread across every available surface, and within 4 hours she had identified at least 7 separate irregularities that required explanation. By the end of the day, she had reduced those 7 to 2 categories: sloppy bookkeeping and deliberate misrepresentation. The sloppy bookkeeping belonged to whoever had managed the records in 1886. The deliberate misrepresentation was more recent, more careful, and pointed with uncomfortable precision toward the cattle feed supplier. She went looking for Cole at dusk. She found him in the barn, finishing up with the horses. A massive operation for one man, the kind of end-of-day work that should have had 3 people handling it. He was rubbing down a gray mare when Evelyn appeared in the barn doorway, and he looked up with the wariness of a man who has learned that news delivered at dusk is rarely the good kind. "The feed supplier," she said. "What's his name?" Cole straightened. "Holt. Darius Holt. Why? He's been billing you for grade A feed at grade A prices and delivering grade B. The difference in cost over 14 months comes to roughly $430. She held up the ledger. "I can show you exactly where." Cole was very still. 400, he stopped, set down the brush, came toward her with a steadiness that she recognized as controlled anger rather than calm. She had seen that particular kind of stillness in a man before, and it was nothing like actual peace. "You're sure?" "I'm good at this," she said simply. "Yes." He took the ledger from her. He looked at the columns she'd marked, the discrepancies she'd noted in her own neat handwriting in the margins. He was quiet for a long time. 14 months, he finally said. "At minimum. The records before that are too inconsistent to give a reliable number." Cole closed the ledger. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read, something complicated and inward, like a man doing a private calculation that had nothing to do with cattle feed. Then he said simply, "Thank you." "I found something else," she said. He waited. "There's a second discrepancy. Smaller, but consistent. Ranch hand wages. The payroll records show 12 men paid through the end of October. But cross-referencing with the supply requisitions and the work logs, I can only account for 10 men's actual labor. Someone is being paid for 2 men who either left or were never employed." Cole's jaw tightened. "I know who," he said. "You don't have to tell me. Gideon Reeves, my foreman's cousin. I should have—" He stopped, pressed his lips together. "I should have caught this months ago." "You run a large operation alone," Evelyn said. There was nothing apologetic about how she said it, and nothing condescending either. It was just accurate. "The books got away from you. That's what I'm here for." He looked at her. She was not sure what he saw. She felt suddenly, acutely aware that she was standing in this man's barn in the last light of a winter afternoon, having just delivered news that would complicate his working relationships and cost him at least one confrontation he probably didn't want to have, and she was doing it with his ledger under her arm, like she'd been here for years instead of one day, and perhaps that was too much. She started. "No," he said. His voice was quieter now, the controlled anger settling into something else. You did good work. Thank you." He said thank you the way a person does when they mean it more than the words quite cover. Red Hollow, Montana. In the winter of 1888, had 3 main industries: cattle, gossip, and suffering. The first 2 kept people alive. The third kept them occupied during the months when the weather was too brutal for the other forms of entertainment available to small frontier towns. Word that Cole Bennett had taken in a widow and her children spread through Red Hollow approximately 48 hours after Evelyn arrived at Blackwood Ranch. By the end of the week, it had been transformed through the particular alchemy of frontier rumor into at least 4 distinct versions, none of which bore more than a surface resemblance to reality. Version 1 held that Evelyn Mercer had bewitched Cole with her looks and now ran the ranch like a queen while Cole's real employees went hungry. Version 2 insisted she was a con woman who had been run out of Wyoming for financial crimes. Version 3. This one came specifically from the church-going community and was delivered in the tone of concerned compassion that is sometimes indistinguishable from vicious gossip, claimed that Cole, in his grief-addled loneliness, had been manipulated by a shameless widow who had used her children as leverage to insert herself into a wealthy man's household. Version 4 was closest to the truth, but least interesting, and therefore had the smallest audience. A woman in desperate circumstances had asked for work, and a man with a large operation and legitimate need had provided employment. Evelyn heard version 1 first, from Lily. She came home from the one-room schoolhouse on a Thursday afternoon with her jaw set in the particular way it got when she was containing something large and was not going to cry about it. She sat at the kitchen table and opened her reading primer and began studying with the focused intensity of a child who is using concentration as a defense against feeling things. Evelyn sat down across from her. "Tell me," she said. Lily looked up. Her eyes were dry. She'd had that under control long before she got home. "Clara Finch said you're living here because you caught a rich man." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "What did you say back?" "I said Clara Finch doesn't know what she's talking about." "And?" Lily's jaw tightened further. "I might have also said she had a face like a river rat." Evelyn pressed her lips together against the thing that wanted to be a smile. "We're going to talk about that part later." "I know. But the first part was correct." Lily nodded. She looked back at her primer, then back up at her mother. "Is it going to get worse?" Evelyn thought about lying. She was good at reading situations, and she had already read this one well enough to know that, yes, it was almost certainly going to get worse. Small towns in winter had too little to occupy them and too much time to develop opinions, and a widow living in a widower's house was the kind of situation that communities either romanticized into sweetness or poisoned into scandal. And from what she'd already observed about Red Hollow's particular character, she wasn't optimistic about which direction it was headed. "Probably," she said. Lily absorbed that. "What do we do?" "We do what we came here to do," Evelyn said. "We work. We earn our place. We don't let other people's stories about us become our own story." Lily looked at her for a moment. She had her father's eyes, dark brown and serious. The kind of eyes that made you feel like you were being considered carefully before any response was offered. "What's our story, then?" Evelyn reached across and tucked a piece of hair behind Lily's ear. "We're still writing it," she said. "That's the whole point." The confrontation with Darius Holt happened on a Saturday, and it did not go quietly. Cole had brought it to a town meeting rather than handling it privately, which Evelyn thought was either very brave or very foolish, though she was beginning to suspect that with this man those two categories overlapped more than usual. He had brought the ledgers, her annotated ledgers, and presented the discrepancies to the 12 men who constituted Red Hollow's informal civic council in the back room of the hardware store. Holt had denied it first. Then he'd accused Evelyn of fabricating the numbers. Then, when 3 other men had looked at the records and reached the same conclusion she had, he'd shifted to claiming the discrepancies were honest mistakes. Cole had been quiet through most of it. When Holt finally ran out of versions of the story, Cole had looked at him across the table with that particular stillness Evelyn was coming to recognize and said, very calmly, "You've done business with this ranch for 9 years, Darius. I hired you when your brother's outfit went under. I gave you consistent work through 2 bad seasons." Holt said nothing. "I need you to tell me," Cole continued, "whether this is the whole of it or whether there's more I'm going to find." Holt looked at his hands. "That's the whole," he said, and then quieter. "I got behind on some debts." "You got behind on debts," Cole repeated, "and instead of coming to me, you decided to take from me." The room was very silent. "Give back what you can," Cole said finally, "and find another operation to supply. We're done." Evelyn, who had been standing near the back of the room where she'd been told she could observe but probably shouldn't speak unless spoken to, watched Holt leave and thought about the particular way Cole had framed that last exchange. "Give back what you can. Not I'll have you arrested. Not you'll pay every cent with interest." The man had been robbed, and his response was measured, firm, and, she was almost certain, deliberately leaving Holt a route out that didn't involve complete destruction. She wasn't sure what to make of that. After the meeting dispersed, she caught up with Cole in the street outside. "You didn't press for full restitution," she said. "No. He owes you $400. More than that." Cole turned up his collar against the cold. "But Holt has 5 kids and a wife with bad lungs. I'm not interested in ruining his family to recover money I can afford to lose." Evelyn looked at him. "A lot of men in your position would have made an example of him." Cole shrugged, not dismissively, more like someone shaking off a coat they don't need. A lot of men in my position haven't buried a family, he said. Makes you look at things different. He said it matter-of-factly, without invitation for further discussion, and walked toward where his horse was hitched. Evelyn stood in the cold street and watched him go, and told herself very firmly and for the third time that week to stop doing whatever it was she kept almost starting to do. She was here to work. She had 2 children who needed stability, not complications. She had enough on her plate without adding this particular complication, which was not on the plate and was not going to get on the plate, and she was going back to the ranch now, and she was going to review the vendor contracts she hadn't finished yet, and that was the end of it. She went back to the ranch. She reviewed the vendor contracts. She stopped almost starting to do the thing at least 4 more times before the week was out. The ranch hands were suspicious of her at first. There were 9 of them. After the payroll fraud was uncovered, Gideon Reeves had left without being formally dismissed, simply packed his things one morning and disappeared, which Cole said was as good as a confession, and they ranged in age from a 17-year-old named Tom Pratt, who had come to Montana from Ohio looking for adventure and found mostly mud and hard labor, to a man called Dutch, who claimed to be 63, looked 80, and had been working cattle since before the Civil War. They weren't hostile to Evelyn exactly, more watchful. The frontier had a deeply embedded social architecture, and a woman in the position she occupied, not wife, not servant, not quite employer, didn't map cleanly onto any of the categories they understood. So they watched her and measured her and waited to see what kind of trouble she turned out to be. The evening reading sessions were not planned. It started because she found Tom Pratt struggling with a written supply manifest one afternoon, turning the paper in his hands like changing the angle would somehow make the words more legible. She asked, without making a production of it, if he wanted help. He said no. She went back to her work. 20 minutes later, he came back and said yes. She read him through the manifest. Then, because he asked, she explained how to sound out the parts he didn't recognize. He stayed for an hour and left knowing 3 words he hadn't known before. The next evening, he was back. He brought Dutch, who claimed he could already read fine, but sat down anyway and turned out to know only slightly more than Tom. By the end of the second week, 4 of the 9 ranch hands were showing up after dinner to sit around the kitchen table with primers Evelyn had sourced from a stack of old schoolbooks Cole had in the ranch office, working through letters and words, and occasionally looking self-conscious about it, but coming back anyway. Cole watched this happen from the doorway one evening without commenting. Evelyn looked up, caught him watching, and he gave her one brief, complicated look before heading back upstairs. She thought about that look for longer than she intended. Amas. Noah got sick in the 3rd week of February. It was nothing serious, a chest cold, the kind children in Montana in winter picked up regularly and usually shook in a week. But serious or not, he was feverish and miserable, and Evelyn spent the first night sitting beside his bed with a damp cloth and a particular quality of fear that only parents know, the fear that has no rational object because you know this is probably fine, but probably is a word that contains multitudes. She was still there at 2 a.m. when she heard the floor creak outside the room. She opened the door to find Cole standing in the hallway in the dark, fully dressed, holding a clay pot with a lid on it. She stared at him. "Old remedy," he said. He sounded slightly embarrassed about it. "My ranch cook used to make it. Honey, ginger, a few other things. It helps with the fever." Evelyn looked at the pot, then at Cole. He was standing in his own hallway at 2 a.m. holding a pot of folk remedy for a child who was not his, and he looked uncomfortable in the way people look when they've done something kind and immediately regretted making it visible. "Where did you—" she started. "Kitchen," he said. "I was already awake. I heard him coughing earlier." He held the pot out. "You don't have to use it." She took it. She looked down at it. She was tired in the specific way of parents who haven't slept properly in days, and she was scared in the specific way that you can't quite explain to someone who hasn't sat with a sick child at 2 a.m. And Cole Bennett was standing in front of her in the dark hallway with his hair badly in need of a cut and a tear in his shirt that still hadn't been repaired, and she was doing the thing again, the thing she kept telling herself not to do. "Thank you," she said. Her voice came out slightly rough. "It's nothing," he said. It wasn't nothing. He clearly knew it wasn't nothing. He went back to his room anyway, and she went back to Noah, and she spent the rest of that night alternating between watching her son's breathing and thinking about a man standing in a dark hallway holding a clay pot and looking embarrassed about his own compassion. By morning, Noah's fever had broken. March arrived like it was apologizing for February. The mud hardened. The sky, which had been the color of dirty wool for months, developed patches of actual blue. The horses, who had been cooped up and surly all winter, began showing signs of interest in the world beyond their stalls. Even the main house at Blackwood Ranch seemed to exhale slightly, the walls losing some of the winter tension that had accumulated in wood and plaster over months of cold. Evelyn noticed the gardens for the first time. They were dead. Had been dead for at least 2 winters, she estimated, judging by the state of the soil and the dried stalks of what had once been a substantial kitchen garden along the south-facing wall of the house. Someone had planted that garden carefully, at some point. The bed structure was deliberate, the placement chosen to maximize the Montana sun during the short growing season. Someone had known what they were doing. She was working in the ranch office one afternoon when Cole came in and found her looking out the window at the dead garden beds. "Those were my wife's," he said. She hadn't heard him come in. She turned, and something about the look on his face made her not apologize for staring. "She loved growing things," he said. He said it flatly, like a fact about the weather, but flat was not the same as unfeeling. She had learned to hear the difference with this man. "I haven't been able to—" He stopped. "Nobody's touched them since." Evelyn turned back to the window. What would she have planted in spring? A long silence. "Tomatoes," he said finally. "Beans. She tried sunflowers twice and they never took. She blamed the soil, but I think it was the altitude." He paused. "She was stubborn about it. She was going to try again the spring He stopped again. Evelyn didn't push it. She'd learned that about grief. You couldn't push it forward, couldn't make it arrive at the destination faster than it wanted to travel. You just kept it company where it was. "The soil looks workable," she said. "When it warms up." Cole was quiet for a moment. "You'd want to try." "I'd want to try." He stood there looking at her for a moment with that complicated internal expression, the one she still hadn't figured out how to read entirely. Then he said, "There's seed in the storage shed. I never got rid of it." "I'll find it," she said. He left the room. She turned back to the window and looked at the dead garden and thought about what it takes to keep seeds you've been carrying for 2 years without planting them, and what kind of hope that is, and whether it counts as hope when you've stopped believing in it. The first wildflower appeared on her kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in late March. She came down to start breakfast, and there it was. A single blue flower, something small and early and improbable, given that winter hadn't entirely released its grip yet, sitting on the corner of the table where it had no business being. Cole was already outside. She could hear him in the yard. She stood and looked at the flower for a long time. It wasn't wrapped in paper. There was no note. There was no explanation. It was just there, as if it had placed itself, as if a wildflower had somehow found its way into the main house of Blackwood Ranch on its own initiative. Evelyn put it in a tin cup of water and set it in the window above the dry sink where it caught the morning light, and she did not say anything about it, and neither did Cole, and somehow that was perfectly exact. The following Tuesday, there was another one, and the Tuesday after that. She never said anything. He never said anything. The flowers kept appearing on Tuesday mornings, and the tin cup on the windowsill kept getting refreshed, and outside the south-facing wall of the house, the dead garden beds were beginning to show the very first signs of being coaxed back to life. It was Dutch who first said it out loud, which surprised nobody who had spent time with Dutch, since the man had never encountered a thought he saw any particular reason not to speak. He said it to Tom Pratt during one of the evening reading sessions, apparently having forgotten, or not caring, that Evelyn was 3 feet away on the other side of the kitchen reviewing invoices. "Boss looks different these days," Dutch said, squinting at the page in front of him. Tom, who was 17 and had learned to be careful, said nothing. "Lighter," Dutch continued, as if completing a thought he'd started earlier in his own head. "Like a man who put something down he was carrying too long." Evelyn kept her eyes on the invoices. "You think he's sweet on her?" Tom asked, in the hushed voice of someone who immediately regretted asking. "Son," Dutch said, with the patience of a man who has watched more human foolishness than he can accurately count. What I think is that two people who keep finding reasons to be in the same room and keep pretending they're not is two people that know something and are both too scared to say it. He turned a page. Now, help me with this word. Evelyn looked at the invoice in front of her and realized she had read the same line 4 times without retaining any of it. She turned the page. She did not say anything. The tin cup in the window caught the lamplight, and outside, somewhere in the spring dark of the Montana plains, something that had been frozen for a long time was beginning, slowly and without fanfare, to thaw. April in Montana could not decide what it wanted to be. Some mornings arrived soft and almost warm, with the kind of pale gold light that made the hills look like something painted rather than real, and you could almost forget that winter had spent the last 4 months trying to kill everything it touched. Then an afternoon would come in cold and cutting, dragging clouds from the north that smelled like more snow even when the calendar insisted on spring, and you'd remember that the land here had no particular interest in being agreeable. Evelyn had been at Blackwood Ranch for 6 weeks when she finally understood the full weight of what she'd walked into. Not the work. The work she understood from the first week, and it suited her the way hard things sometimes suit people who have spent too long not being allowed to do them. The accounts were coming into order. The vendor contracts had been reviewed and 2 more quietly renegotiated, saving Cole somewhere in the neighborhood of $60 a season. The payroll records were clean now, transparent, the kind of records a man could read himself in 10 minutes and know exactly where his money was going. That part she had handled without drama because drama was expensive and she couldn't afford it. What she hadn't fully reckoned with those first weeks was Red Hollow itself. The town had been watching. She'd known that. She'd told Lily as much, had told herself as much, had filed it under problems to manage alongside the vendor contracts and the broken fence line on the east pasture that still needed materials to fix. What she hadn't anticipated was the particular shape the watching would take, or who would end up doing most of it. Walter Crow ran the bank in Red Hollow. He was a compact man in his mid-50s, well-dressed in the way of men who use clothing to communicate authority. They're not entirely confident they possess otherwise, with pale eyes that had the unsettling quality of always seeming to be calculating something just behind whatever conversation was happening on the surface. He had done business with Cole Bennett for nearly a decade, held the paper on 2 of the ranch's operational loans, had extended credit during a rough season 3 years back when the cattle prices collapsed, and he had in that time developed a proprietary attitude toward Cole's affairs that he had never been asked to develop and had never been invited to relinquish. Evelyn met him for the first time at the general store, a Wednesday in early April, and understood him completely within approximately 4 minutes of conversation. She had come in for flour and lamp oil and a few other supplies, Noah in tow because he'd been restless all morning and Lily was at school. Noah was examining a display of penny candy with the focused attention of a 5-year-old operating on a budget of 0 and a degree of hope that Evelyn found both heartbreaking and admirably optimistic. Crow introduced himself with the particular manner of a man who expects the introduction to land with some weight. "Walter Crow," he said, extending a hand. "I hold the paper on Blackwood Ranch's operating accounts." "Evelyn Mercer," she said. "I manage the ranch accounts." Something passed across his face. It was fast. He was practiced at keeping his expression civil, but she caught it. A flicker of recalibration, the face of a man who had expected to deliver information and had instead received it. "I'd heard Bennett took on some help," Crow said. The word help landed with a very specific texture, soft enough to be deniable, pointed enough to be felt. "He did," Evelyn said pleasantly. She picked up the flower. "Must be a comfort," Crow continued. "A man in his position. Lonely out there, Blackwood Ranch. Big house for 1 person." He smiled. It was a practiced smile. "And now there are children on the property, I hear. 2 of them." Noah, still studying the penny candy, said without turning around, "I'm one of them." Evelyn pressed her lips together. "Smart boy," Crow said, and the way he said it made it clear he did not especially mean it. He looked back at Evelyn. "I hope the arrangement is working out for all parties." "It's working out very well," she said. She paid for her supplies. "It was nice to meet you, Mr. Crow." She took Noah by the hand and left. Outside, walking back toward where she'd hitched the horse, Noah said, "I didn't like that man." "Why not?" "He smiles, but his eyes don't." He looked up at her. Papa used to say that was a bad sign. Evelyn looked down at her son. 5 years old and already carrying his father around in his mouth like a stone he kept finding in his pocket. "Your papa was right," she said. She made a note of Walter Crowe the way she made notes of everything that required future attention. Quietly, precisely, without letting on that she'd made it. Within 2 weeks, she understood why the note mattered. The first sign was subtle. Margaret Hollis, who ran the dry goods store and had been perfectly cordial on 3 previous visits, became oddly stiff during Evelyn's 4th. Not rude. Small towns couldn't afford outright rudeness with customers. It was bad business. But stiff in the way of someone who has heard something and is now performing the effort of pretending they haven't. She counted Evelyn's change twice, which she hadn't done before, the extra count communicating something wordless about trust. The second sign was Lily, who came home from school on a Thursday with that jaw set again, tighter than before. "Clara Finch again?" Evelyn asked. "Clara Finch's mother," Lily said, and sat down at the table and opened her book with a force that suggested she was done discussing it. Evelyn let it sit until after dinner, when Noah was asleep and the kitchen was quiet. Then she sat down across from Lily and waited. Lily turned a page she probably hadn't read. She said, Lily started and stopped. Tried again. "Mrs. Finch told Clara to stop eating lunch with me," she said. Another stop. Her hands were flat on the table now, not holding the book anymore. She said, "Women like you corrupt decent communities." The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn looked at her daughter's hands on the table. 7 years old, fingers still slightly too small for the size they were going to be, the nail on her left thumb bitten down the way it got when she was anxious. And she felt something move through her that was several things at once and not entirely composed of calm. "Lily," she said. "I know," Lily said, before Evelyn could continue. Her voice was controlled in the way of someone holding something at arm's length by sheer will. "I know it isn't true. I know Mrs. Finch is—" She paused, searching for a word she'd been taught not to use. "I know she's wrong." "She is, but it doesn't stop." Lily looked up. "It just keeps going. Every time I think—" She stopped, and for one moment the 7-year-old won against the effort to be composed, and her lip trembled once before she pulled it back. "I just want it to stop." Evelyn reached across and put both hands over Lily's. She did not tell her daughter that people were just scared of what they didn't understand, because she found that explanation insufficient and slightly dishonest. She did not tell her it would blow over soon, because she didn't know that. She did not reach for anything comfortable that wasn't true. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry. It's not fair, and it's not right, and I know that doesn't make it stop." Lily turned her hands over and held her mother's. They sat like that for a while, the two of them, in the quiet kitchen of Blackwood Ranch with the lamp burning low and the spring dark pressing against the windows. And Evelyn thought about Walter Crowe's practiced smile and Margaret Hollis counting change twice, and a 7-year-old girl sitting alone at lunch because a grown woman had decided to teach her daughter that cruelty could be dressed up as moral concern. She thought about Cole's words back in the hardware store, the evening he'd addressed Holt. A lot of men in your position would have made an example of him. She had respected the measured response then. She was finding it harder to locate that kind of measured response right now, but she held it. She held it because Lily was watching her, and Lily would take her cues from what she saw, and what Evelyn wanted her daughter to see was a woman who did not fall apart under the weight of other people's ugliness. Later that same night, well past when the children were asleep, she heard Cole come in from a late ride. He'd been checking the east fence line, something about recent cattle movement that needed attention, and she was still at the kitchen table with the lamp and a cup of tea gone cold beside her. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her. "You're up late," he said. "Couldn't sleep." He hung his coat. He came into the kitchen and stood for a moment, and then, in the way he had developed of registering that something was wrong without requiring it to be announced, he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Town," he said. It wasn't a question. "It's getting worse," she said. She said it plainly, without drama, the way she would report a column of numbers that didn't add up. "Lily is being excluded at school. The women in town are—" "There's a campaign happening, Cole. I don't know the full shape of it yet, but it has a shape." Cole was quiet. "I wanted you to know," she said. "Not because I'm asking you to do something about it. I can handle my own problems. But if it's affecting the ranch's reputation, affecting your business relationships, that's yours to know. He turned his coffee cup slowly between his hands. Who's running it? She didn't answer immediately. Crow, he said, before she could. I think so. Cole set the cup down. He's been in that bank for 16 years, and he's had his fingers in half the decisions in this county that whole time. He doesn't like things that happen without his knowledge or his approval. He looked at her directly. He doesn't like me having someone here who understands the accounts. I noticed he introduced himself by telling me he holds your paper. A short silence. Did he? Within 40 seconds of meeting me, Cole's jaw moved in the way it did when he was managing something internally. I should have dealt with Crow a long time ago, he said, more to himself than to her. What stopped you? He looked at her. The loans. The operational loans. She had seen them in the records. They were structured normally, nothing immediately alarming, but she had flagged them for review because the terms had some flexibility built in that she wanted to understand better. Can they be called in early, with sufficient cause? He paused. Which Crow defines. Show me the contracts. Evelyn, show me the contracts. She said it the same way she said everything when she meant it. Not loud, not hard, just absolutely direct. If there's legal exposure in how those loans are structured, I want to find it before he decides to use it. Cole looked at her for a moment. She had the sense, not for the first time, of being regarded as something he hadn't expected and wasn't sure how to categorize. Not unpleasantly, more the way you look at something that keeps surprising you past the point where you thought you'd stopped being surprised. He went and got the contracts. They sat at the kitchen table until well past midnight, 2 people and a lamp and a stack of legal papers, while the spring wind moved across the Montana plains and the house settled around them into its nighttime quiet. Cole was not a man who talked much during working silence, which Evelyn had come to appreciate deeply. He'd refill her tea without being asked. He'd pass her a relevant page without needing her to reach for it. They moved around each other's working rhythms without friction, which was remarkable given that 6 weeks ago they had been strangers. At midnight, she found the clause. It was buried in the 1886 loan agreement under a section titled Operational Continuity Requirements, which was the kind of legal language designed to sound routine while meaning something more specific. The clause required that Blackwood Ranch's management structure remain free of what it called reputational encumbrances, language loose enough to mean almost anything Crow wanted it to mean, tight enough to constitute legal cause for a formal review. There, she said. Cole leaned over. He read the clause twice. Son of a... He stopped, sat back. He had that put in when I was raw from losing Margaret and the baby. I wasn't reading things carefully enough. He looked at the ceiling. I signed it. You didn't know what you were signing. Doesn't change what I signed. No, she said. But knowing it now means we can plan for it. She looked at the clause again. He can't actually call in the loan over this. The language is vague enough that any county judge would require a specific and demonstrable reputational harm, not just a social arrangement he personally dislikes. What he can do is make noise, make your vendors nervous, make your credit relationships uncomfortable. She set the contract down. He's counting on you settling quietly. I've done that before, Cole said. He was not proud of it when he said it. I know. She had seen the pattern in the financial records. Twice in the last 3 years, contract renegotiations that had gone in Crow's favor at moments when Cole would have been least able to fight them. Small surrenders, almost invisible unless you were looking at the whole picture at once. That's over now. Cole looked at her. She realized, half a second after she'd said it, that it had come out with considerably more certainty than she had any clear right to feel, given that she was an employee and not a partner, and had no authority to tell this man what was or wasn't over in his own financial affairs. She opened her mouth to qualify it. Yeah, Cole said quietly. It is. She closed her mouth. The lamp flickered between them. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and the silence had that specific quality of a silence that contains more than silence, the kind you can hear the edges of if you're paying attention. Cole stood up. He gathered the contracts into a neat pile and set them by the ledger she'd been working from. Get some sleep, he said. I mean it. You've been running on 4 hours a night for 3 weeks. 5 hours, she corrected. Evelyn, I'm fine. You're stubborn. Those aren't mutually exclusive. He looked at her for a moment, and there was something in his face, not quite a smile, it didn't go that far, but something that lived in the neighborhood of a smile. And then he turned and went up the stairs. She sat at the table a moment longer. She looked at the loan contract. She looked at the tin cup on the windowsill where this week's wildflower had dried to papery softness in the spring air, kept there anyway. Stop it, she told herself. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. She did not entirely stop it. The reading sessions had changed by the second month. What had started as Evelyn helping Tom Pratt sound out a supply manifest had evolved into something that occupied the kitchen table 4 nights a week and had expanded to include 6 of the 9 ranch hands, a rotating cast of their particular reading struggles, and increasingly complicated discussions about things that had nothing directly to do with reading. It was Dutch who turned it into something bigger than it was supposed to be. He had arrived one Tuesday night with a copy of a territorial land rights notice he'd received about grazing allotments on the southern pasture, and after they'd read through it together, he'd said, "So what does that mean for us, practically?" Evelyn had explained what the grazing allotment notice meant for their access to the southern pasture. Tom had asked a follow-up question about how that interacted with the east fence line dispute Cole had mentioned. And then a man named Arlo, quiet, mid-30s, who'd been coming to the sessions for 3 weeks but mostly observed rather than participated, said, "Is it true what they're saying in town? About the ranch?" The kitchen got slightly quieter. "What are they saying?" Evelyn asked. She kept her voice the same as it had been, easy and direct, like it was the same category of question as the land rights notice. Arlo looked at the table. "That you've got hooks in the boss, that the ranch is going sideways because of it." Silence. "The ranch," Evelyn said, "turned a profit in March for the first time in 8 months. Vendor fraud has been addressed. The payroll records are clean, and the operating accounts are current on all obligations." She paused. "Is that going sideways?" Arlo looked up. "No, ma'am. The things being said in town are coming from a man who benefits from this ranch running poorly," she said. "I can't make people stop saying them. What I can do is make sure the work is clean enough that anyone who looks at the actual records has a hard time arguing with what's in front of them." Tom said, with the blunt accuracy of a 17-year-old, "Dutch said Crow tried to buy out Cole's North grazing contract 2 years ago, and Cole told him to go to hell." "I did not say that," Dutch said. "You said something that meant that." "I said he declined, in terms not typically printed in newspapers." Evelyn looked at the table of men in the lamplight. Different ages, different histories, all of them having come here for the specific purpose of learning something they'd been denied or delayed, and all of them now navigating the awareness that the woman teaching them was at the center of a situation that could blow back on all of them. They were measuring something. She could feel it. "If any of you feel like your position here has gotten complicated because of me," she said, "I understand that. This ranch is your livelihood, and I'm not asking anyone to carry trouble they didn't sign up for." Dutch set down his primer. He looked at her with the patience of a man who has seen everything and has very little energy left for nonsense. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "I've been working cattle since I was 14 years old. I worked for 3 outfit owners who drank their profits, one who cheated his hands on wages, and one who was purely mean for no reason I ever figured out." He picked his primer back up. "This is the first time since I was maybe 30 years old that I'm at a table where someone's got a lamp burning for me to learn something." He opened the book. "Now, somebody help me with this paragraph." Tom reached over and pointed to the line. Evelyn looked down at her own page. The lamp burned. Outside, a spring storm was building somewhere over the northern hills, the air through the kitchen window carrying that particular pressure that preceded rain. Nobody mentioned Crow again that night, but Evelyn was thinking about him, in the back of the part of her mind that she kept running in parallel to everything else, the part that tracked problems and plotted contingencies, and never fully rested even when the rest of her was tired. She had found the clause in the loan contract. She knew its shape now. What she needed to understand was Crow's timeline, whether he was building toward a specific move or simply maintaining a slow-pressure campaign designed to make Cole's life uncomfortable enough that he'd make a decision Crow could benefit from. She needed to know more about Walter Crow. And the best way to know more about Walter Crow was to understand who, in Red Hollow, He had not yet managed to turn to his side. She started watching for that on her next trip into town 2 days later, with the same quiet precision she brought to everything. Not obvious about it, just paying attention. And she noticed something interesting. The school teacher, a woman named Agnes Barrow, mid-40s, single, possessed of an expression that suggested she had been underestimated her entire life and had mixed feelings about correcting people, was the one person in every room Evelyn entered who did not perform the slight stiffening, the recalibrated smile, the twice-counted change. Agnes Barrow looked at Evelyn directly, the way you look at someone you're seeing rather than someone you're performing a reaction for. Evelyn didn't force it. She waited. It was Agnes who made the first move, stopping her outside the post office on a Thursday morning with the directness of someone who had made a decision and was following through before she could think herself out of it. "Your daughter," Agnes said. "Lily." "Yes. She is the sharpest student I have had in 4 years of teaching this school." Agnes said it flatly, as an accounting of fact. "She is reading 3 grades above her age, her arithmetic is nearly flawless, and she has more intellectual curiosity than children twice her age." She paused. "I want you to know that, in case other things are making it difficult for her to feel that." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Something was happening in her chest that she didn't have an immediate word for. Gratitude was part of it, but not all. "Thank you," she said. "I also want you to know," Agnes continued, slightly more carefully, "that not everyone in this town is listening to Walter Crowe. Some of us have watched him operate for a long time and have our own opinions about it." They looked at each other on the wooden sidewalk in the April sun. "I appreciate that," Evelyn said. Agnes nodded once, briskly, like a woman who has said the things she came to say and is now moving on with her day. She walked past and into the post office. Evelyn stood in the sun for a moment. One person, she thought. That's how things change. One person at a time. One honest word in the right direction. Walter Crowe had months of groundwork behind him. She had Agnes Barrow on a Thursday morning. It would have to be enough to start with. She went to get her mail. The letter waiting for her in the post office box was the third one she'd received since arriving at Blackwood Ranch. The first 2 had been from James's creditors, following up on debts already settled. This one had a different return address, a law office in Cheyenne, and the formal weight of its envelope told her before she opened it that it was not going to be simple. She read it standing at the post office counter, Noah beside her making an elaborate game of balancing on the edge of a floor plank. It was from her late husband's business partner. More accurately, his former business partner, who had apparently decided that the debt settlements Evelyn had arranged 18 months ago had not been final, and was now asserting a claim against her late husband's personal estate, what remained of it, through a legal avenue she hadn't known existed. The amount claimed was significant. Evelyn folded the letter. She put it in her coat pocket. She took Noah's hand and walked out of the post office into the April sunlight. "Mama?" Noah said. "It's fine," she said. She said it the way she said everything she was not yet sure was true. Firmly, as a statement of intent rather than current fact. Because sometimes the decision to believe a thing was the only tools you had to work with. She walked back to where the horse was hitched. She had work to do. She didn't tell Cole about the letter. That was the first mistake. And she knew it was a mistake even as she was making it, the way you sometimes know exactly where you're going wrong and go there anyway, because the alternative requires a conversation you don't have the architecture for yet. She folded the letter from the Cheyenne law office into the back of the ledger she kept in the ranch office, behind 3 months of vendor receipts where it would not accidentally surface, and she told herself she needed more information before she brought it to anyone. That was partly true. The other part, the part she was less willing to look at directly, was that the letter represented something that could make her a liability. Not just a woman with a complicated social situation in a hostile town, but a woman with active legal exposure. A claim against her estate that, if pursued aggressively, could follow her, could follow the people around her. She had worked too hard to become useful at Blackwood Ranch to become a problem instead. So she put the letter behind the receipts, and she did what she always did, which was to keep moving. May arrived with the kind of weather that made Montana feel like a completely different place than the thing it had been in February. The hills going green in earnest now, the pastures filling out, the horses getting fat on actual grass after months of supplemental feed. The south-facing garden beds, which Evelyn had been quietly working since mid-March, were showing real progress. Beans coming up in organized rows, tomato seedlings she'd started inside and transferred carefully to the garden. And in the far corner, almost defiantly, 2 rows of sunflower seedlings that had absolutely no business surviving the last cold snap, but had managed it anyway. Cole had not commented on the sunflowers directly, but she'd caught him looking at them from the office window one morning in a way that made her chest do that complicated thing she kept trying to manage. She was getting worse at managing it. The evening reading sessions were 3 months old now, and they had become, without anyone formally deciding this, one of the fixed points of the ranch's weekly rhythm. Tom Pratt could read through a full supply manifest without stopping. Dutch had worked his way through a territorial pamphlet on grazing rights and emerged with opinions he was now sharing with everyone who stood still long enough to listen. A quiet hand named Arlo had discovered, somewhat to his own visible surprise, that he had a facility for numbers once someone sat down and explained how columns were supposed to work. It was Arlo who first mentioned Walter Crow's name directly in Cole's presence. The 4 of them, Evelyn, Cole, Tom, and Arlo, were at the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening. Evelyn was walking Arlo through a monthly reconciliation, using it as a teaching exercise because Arlo had expressed interest in understanding how the accounts worked, and Cole had come in for coffee and stayed, as he sometimes did now, sitting slightly apart from the working group with his own papers but clearly listening. "These numbers here," Arlo said, pointing to a column. "Somebody changed them." "Corrected them," Evelyn said. "The original entries had a transposition error." "How do you tell the difference between a correction and someone changing them on purpose?" "You look at the surrounding context," she said. "A correction usually happens once, a pattern of changes all in one direction, all benefiting the same party. That's something else." Arlo absorbed this. Like what Holt was doing. Tom, who had been quiet, said, "Like what Crow's doing now." The kitchen went slightly still. Cole looked up from his papers. "What do you mean?" Evelyn said carefully. Tom looked between her and Cole with the expression of someone who has said a thing and is now calculating whether he should finish saying it. He decided to finish. "He was at the hardware store talking to Dobbins last week. I was getting supplies and they didn't see me in the back. He told Dobbins that the ranch was running on a woman's emotion and a widower's loneliness, and that anyone doing business with Bennett right now was taking a risk." He paused. "That's more or less exact." Cole was very still. "Running on a woman's emotion," he repeated. His voice had that particular flatness that was not calm. "That's what he said." Cole set down his pen. He stood up from the table. He stood there for a moment, and Evelyn could see him working through something. Not the anger, he had that in hand, but something behind the anger, something that had a different quality to it. "He can say what he wants," Evelyn said. "He's not just saying it," Cole said. "He's saying it to Dobbins. Dobbins supplies half the ranches in this county. If Dobbins gets nervous about his relationship with me, then we need vendors who aren't susceptible to Crow's opinion," Evelyn said, "which is actually a structural improvement to the ranch's supply chain regardless of Crow. We've been too consolidated." She stopped. "I'm sorry, this is your business. I'm not trying to—" "You're right," Cole said. He looked at her. "Don't apologize when you're right." She held his gaze for a moment. "I've been doing some research," she said, "on Crow's other business relationships. The way he's structured certain contracts around town. He has arrangements with 4 vendors who also supply this ranch. If he's applying pressure through those channels, I want to know the full shape of it before it arrives. How long have you been looking at this?" 2 weeks. Cole was quiet for a moment. She could see him processing the fact that she'd been working this problem without telling him, and she waited for what that would look like when it arrived. "What else?" he said. "Just that." She hesitated 1 second longer than she intended to. His eyes sharpened. "Evelyn, what else?" She went to the ledger on the shelf. She found the letter behind the receipts. She set it on the table in front of him. He read it. He read it twice, which was not a good sign. Then he set it down on the table and looked at the window for a moment with an expression she didn't have a name for. "Cheyenne," he said. "Yes?" "This partner, Hendricks, what's his actual legal position here?" "Weak," she said. Possibly. But the territory's inheritance laws are complex, and if he files in a county where the judge knows him, how much? She told him the number. Tom and Arlo had quietly exited the kitchen somewhere in the previous 2 minutes. Evelyn registered their absence without looking at the door. "Why didn't you tell me?" Cole said. He wasn't angry. That was somehow harder. "Because it's my problem," she said. "It's a problem you're carrying in my ranch office behind my receipts." That landed. She didn't have a clean answer for it. "You're right," she said. "I'm sorry." He looked at her directly. "Evelyn, when something comes for you, it needs to come through me first. I'm not trying to take over your situation, but you have 2 children in this house, and you're carrying things alone that you don't have to carry alone anymore, and I need you to understand that." The kitchen was very quiet. "You have enough to carry," she said. Her voice came out slightly rough around the edges. "That's not your call to make." She looked at him. He looked at her. The lamp was burning low, and somewhere outside a nightbird was doing something repetitive and unromantic in the dark. And the letter from the Cheyenne law office was sitting between them on the table. And Evelyn was doing that thing again, the thing she had spent 3 months telling herself not to do, and this time she did not entirely succeed at stopping it. "Okay," she said. "Okay." He pulled the letter across the table and looked at it again. "I know a lawyer in Helena who handles territorial inheritance disputes. Good man, reasonable rates. I'll write to him this week." "Cole, I can't ask you to—" "You didn't ask me." He folded the letter precisely and set it beside his pen. "I'm telling you what I'm doing." She stared at the table. "You know this is going to make things worse with Crow," she said. "If he finds out you paid legal fees for my—" "Let him." Cole picked up his pen. "I'm tired of making decisions based on what Crow thinks about them." He said it quietly, without drama, as a statement of fact, and it was possibly the most definitive thing she'd heard him say since the night he'd told Holt they were done. She picked up her own pen. She went back to the reconciliation sheet. They worked in silence for another hour, the 2 of them in the low lamplight, and the silence was a different quality now than it had been before. Warmer, less careful, like a room where a window has been opened that had been shut too long. It was the last easy night for a while. The thing with Crow escalated faster than Evelyn had expected, which told her she'd miscalculated his timeline. She'd been expecting a slow build, the kind of pressure campaign that plays out over months. What she hadn't accounted for was an early May cattle sale that went badly. Cole had arranged to sell 100 head to a buyer in Billings. Good price, planned transaction, the kind of reliable income the ranch needed to offset the first quarter losses from the feed fraud. 2 days before the sale, the buyer withdrew. He cited concerns about the current operational stability of Blackwood Ranch in a letter that had the texture, Evelyn thought when she read it, of language written by a man who'd had it suggested to him. Cole lost the sale. He lost 30 days of planning and the income they'd counted on. He did not come to dinner that night. He was in the barn when Evelyn brought the children in from the garden, and he was still there 2 hours later. She sent the children to bed, and she stood in the kitchen for 10 minutes making a decision. And then she took 2 cups of coffee out to the barn. He was sitting on an upturned bucket near the gray mare's stall, elbows on his knees, looking at nothing. She held out a cup. He took it without looking up. "You read the letter," he said. "Yes." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "I can cover it. It won't break anything. It's the principle." "I know." Crow reached into a transaction that was none of his business and killed it because he could. He looked up. His eyes were tired in a way that went past one bad day. "He's done this before. Not to me, but I've watched him do it to other people. Chip away until they either fold or make mistakes." He paused. "I always told myself I'd deal with it when it got to my door. And now it's at your door, with you in the middle of it." He looked at her. "That's the part I keep getting stuck on." Evelyn sat down on the hay bale across from him. "Don't." "Don't what?" "Don't make this about protecting me. I'm not a reason to fold." He looked at her. "I'm also not a reason to fight if the fight isn't worth having," she said. "But from everything I've looked at, Crow's position is weaker than he wants you to think. The loan clause is legally soft. His vendor pressure works on people who are scared of him, but if you start building relationships with vendors outside his network—" She stopped. "I keep doing this." "Keep doing what?" "Turning everything into an accounts problem." It is an accounts problem, he said. Mostly. The ghost of something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but the structural memory of one. And I keep listening, mostly. She looked at him over her coffee cup. Outside, the May night had come in warm for once. The air through the barn's open upper door carrying grass and earth instead of ice. The horses moved in their stalls with the peaceful sounds of large animals settling into sleep. Somewhere in the middle distance, a coyote made a brief, inquiring sound and went quiet. "My wife would have liked you," Cole said. He said it simply, looking at his coffee, and it had the quality of something he'd been sitting with for a while rather than something that had just arrived. Evelyn was quiet. She was practical, he said. Didn't have much patience for things that weren't real. She could... He stopped. She would have figured Crow out in about 5 minutes and had a plan by 10. She sounds formidable. She was. He turned the cup in his hands. She was also the kind of person who made other people better by being in the room. Not on purpose, just... She made you want to be more careful about who you were. He looked up. You do that too. Evelyn didn't know what to do with that. She looked at the hay bale. Cole, she started. I'm not... He stopped himself. I'm not saying it as anything. I just wanted to say it, because she deserves to be said about in the same sentence as someone good, and because you deserve to hear it. She looked at him for a long moment. Thank you, she said. It came out quieter than she intended. He nodded. He finished his coffee. He stood up and looked at the mare for a moment, who was ignoring them with the total indifference of a horse who has heard enough human conversation for one night. Go to sleep, he said. I'll be in. She went inside. She climbed the stairs and stood in the hallway outside her door for a moment, and pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and breathed through the thing that was happening in her chest, which was too large and too complicated and completely inconvenient. She went to sleep. She did not, for a significant portion of the night, actually sleep. The eavesdropping happened 3 weeks later, on a Thursday night in the last week of May, and it undid 6 weeks of hard-won equilibrium in approximately 11 minutes. She had been coming downstairs for water. She'd been doing that more often lately, the nights having gotten warmer and the insomnia that had been her companion for 18 months, showing no particular sign of releasing its lease. She was on the stairs when she heard voices from the front room, Cole's voice, and someone else's, lower, rougher, a man's voice she didn't immediately recognize. She stopped on the third stair. She should have announced herself. She knew that. She stayed anyway, in the dark of the staircase, because something in the voices had the quality of a conversation she needed to hear. The second voice belonged to Roy Harker, she realized, Cole's oldest neighbor, whose property bordered Blackwood Ranch on the western line. A man in his 60s, solid, cautious, the kind of cattleman who'd seen enough boom and bust to have ground down most of his opinions to a practical nub. Not telling you it's right, Roy was saying. I'm telling you it's what's happening. Crow had a meeting at the hardware store last Tuesday. 8 men there. He told them the ranch is compromised, that you've got a woman running your books and running your house and running your better judgment. He said, a pause. He said you've gone soft, that Bennett's folly, that's what he's calling Blackwood now. He said any man who does business with you is investing in a sentiment and not a cattle operation. Silence from Cole. I've got 3 contracts I sourced through you, Roy said. I'm not cutting them. I want you to know that. But 2 other operators said they're pulling back until they see which way this settles. He paused again. It's your reputation, Cole. 4 years you built it back after Margaret died. 4 years of people respecting what you built here. Crow is pulling the thread on that, and I think you need to hear it plain. I'm hearing it, Cole said. The woman, her name is Evelyn. A pause. Evelyn, she's... Roy seemed to be choosing his words. She seems capable. Nobody's saying otherwise. But capable isn't the same as... This isn't Wyoming, Cole. There are ways things are done here, and there are ways they aren't. Having her here the way she's here is going to cost you more than... Roy. Cole's voice was flat. I appreciate you coming. I'm trying to help. I know. Thank you. A long silence. Is she worth it? Roy asked. He said it without judgment, just a man asking a direct question. That's all I'm asking. Is she worth what this is going to cost you? The silence from Cole went on long enough that Evelyn, on the staircase, stopped breathing. "That's not the right question," Cole said finally. "Cole, the right question is whether I'm willing to go back to being the man I was before she got here." He paused. "And I'm not." Evelyn leaned back against the wall of the staircase. She heard Roy Harker leave. She heard the front door close. She heard Cole's footsteps move toward the kitchen and then stop, and then the sound of him sitting down somewhere, and then silence. She sat on the third stair in the dark for a long time. She went back upstairs. She did not get water. She did not sleep. She lay on her bed in the warm May dark and replayed Roy Harker's voice saying, "2 other operators said they're pulling back, and it's your reputation, Cole, and 4 years you built it back." And she felt the shape of what she was doing to this man's life, assembling itself in the dark above her bed with an architectural clarity that was very hard to argue with. She had been telling herself she was earning her place. She had been telling herself the work was clean, the accounts were in order, the situation was manageable. She had been telling herself that Crow's campaign was something she and Cole could address together with patience and good records and the support of people like Agnes Barrow and Dutch. What she had not been fully accounting for, what Roy Harker's voice made impossible to keep not accounting for, was that the damage to Cole's reputation was not something she could fix with a clean ledger. It was happening in hardware stores and over fences between neighboring ranches, in the particular social language of frontier men who measured each other in specific and unforgiving ways. And every week she stayed was another week. It got worse. She stared at the ceiling. She thought about Lily eating lunch alone. She thought about Cole losing the Billings cattle sale. She thought about 2 operators pulling back. She thought about him saying, "I'm not willing to go back to being the man I was before she got here." And she thought about how that was possibly the kindest thing anyone had said about her in years, and how it made the thing she was thinking of doing feel worse, not better, which was probably the correct response. And she did it anyway. She started planning. She gave herself 2 days to be sure. She spent those 2 days finishing the quarterly accounts so they'd be in clean order when she was gone. She organized the vendor files, updated the reconciliation sheets, made notes in the margins of the current contracts explaining anything that wasn't self-evident. She wrote out the analysis of Crow's loan clause in a separate document with clear language so that Cole, or whoever he brought in next, would have the ammunition they needed. She found the activity of preparing her own replacement useful in the way that forward motion was always useful. You could outpace almost any feeling if you kept moving. Lily knew something was wrong by the second evening. Children that age lived close to the emotional weather of the adults around them, and Lily had been calibrated to her mother's particular weather patterns for 18 months of difficulty. She didn't ask directly. She sat at the dinner table and watched Evelyn with those serious dark eyes and ate her food and said nothing, which was its own kind of asking. Noah remained blissfully unaware, which was a mercy. The night Evelyn chose was a Saturday in early June. A storm had been building all day from the northwest, the real kind, the Montana kind that meant business, with a sky the color of a bruise by mid-afternoon and thunder working its way down from the mountains by early evening. The ranch hands had gotten the horses settled and the loose equipment secured before dark. By 10 o'clock, the rain had started, hard and serious, hammering the roof with the indiscriminate force of weather that wasn't doing anything personal to you, but felt that way anyway. She waited until the house was quiet. She put the children's things in the wagon first, working by the light of a single lantern in the barn, moving quickly and precisely the way she did everything when she was running on decision rather than feeling. The blankets, the food she'd packed that afternoon, the small tin box that held what remained of James's silver ring, and $23 she'd saved from her wages over 3 months. She was hitching the second horse when Noah appeared in the barn doorway. He was barefoot. He was wearing his nightshirt. He was looking at her with a 5-year-old's directness, which contains no strategy and no softness, just the pure, unmediated question. "Are we leaving?" he asked. She looked at her son in the lantern light, rain driving against the barn roof, and something cracked in her chest that she did not have the tools to repair right now. "Go inside, baby," she said. "Go back to bed." "Why are we leaving?" "Noah, is it because of the men in town?" His voice was very steady for a 5-year-old. She had raised him in a hard time, and the hardness had gotten into him, into the particular straightness of how he stood even barefoot in a cold barn in a storm. "Lily said men in town are saying bad things about you." "Lily's right." She went back to the harness. And sometimes when people say things about you, it hurts the people around you, even when it isn't true, even when it isn't fair. Is that why we're leaving? Yes. Does Mr. Cole know? She stopped. She had her hands on the harness buckle, and she had stopped moving because the question had a weight she hadn't been prepared for, simple and exact. Not yet, she said. Noah considered this for approximately 3 seconds with the unnerving moral seriousness of a child who has not yet learned to rationalize. Then he turned and ran back across the yard to the house through the rain. She stood in the barn and thought, oh no. She went after him. She crossed the yard in the driving rain and pushed through the kitchen door, and Noah was already on the stairs. She could hear him, small wet feet on the wood steps, running. She was at the bottom of the stairs when she heard him bang on Cole's door. Mr. Cole, he said, loud, urgent, the voice of a child who has decided to burn down all the possible consequences. My mama is leaving. She's putting the horses in the wagon. You have to come. Silence from Cole's room. Then boots on the floor. Immediate. No hesitation. Evelyn stood at the bottom of the stairs with rain dripping off her coat, and she thought, briefly and uselessly, about all the alternative versions of this night where she had been faster. Cole came out of his room fully dressed. He took in Noah's wet feet and Evelyn's soaked coat and the general information being communicated by the situation, and he came down the stairs with a look on his face that she did not have a word for. Not anger, not the controlled flatness she'd seen when he was managing something difficult. Something rawer than either. He didn't speak to her in the house. He walked past her and through the kitchen door and out into the rain. She followed him. Because there was nothing else to do, she followed him. He was in the barn already, standing beside the half-hitched horse, looking at the wagon she'd packed with her children's belongings, the blankets and the food, and the small tin box, and the look on his face when he turned was the most unguarded thing she'd seen from him in 4 months. Don't, he said. Cole, don't. He crossed the barn in 4 strides and stopped in front of her close enough that she could see the rain on his face and the precise quality of what was happening in his eyes, which was not something she'd allowed herself to look at directly until now. I heard Roy Harker. I know what he said. Then I know he told me things that were true about what people are saying, Cole said. I also know that I sat in my kitchen after he left, and I thought about what my life looks like without you and those children in it, and Evelyn. He stopped. He put his hand on her shoulder. Just one hand, just steady. A man holding on to something because it matters. The land doesn't mean enough. The contracts don't mean enough. None of it means enough. Rain drove against the barn roof. You'll lose vendors, she said. Her voice was not quite steady. You'll lose contracts. Roy said 2 operators are already... I don't care about 2 operators. Your reputation? My reputation is what? He said it quietly, not angry, just asking. A man who sent a woman away because the town didn't approve? That's a reputation I can do without. She looked at him. She was soaking wet, and she had been not sleeping for weeks, and she had spent 2 days preparing to disappear, and she was standing in his barn in a storm, and he was looking at her like she was the thing that made the rest of it make sense. And she was running out of arguments because the arguments she had were real and legitimate, and she believed in them, and she still didn't want to go. I have legal trouble, she said. The Hendricks claim. The letter from Cheyenne. I wrote to the lawyer in Helena 3 weeks ago, he said. He wrote back. It's manageable. She stared at him. You already... Yes. Without telling me. You didn't ask me. I did it anyway. He looked at her steadily. I believe you said something about that once. Despite everything, the rain, the barn, the packed wagon, the entire architecture of the bad night she had been building for 2 days, something moved in her chest that was embarrassingly close to a laugh. That's not... She stopped. That's not the same thing. Isn't it? She looked at him for a long moment. The rain was letting up slightly, the thunder moving east, the worst of the storm passing the way storms eventually do, regardless of what's happening underneath them. I have 2 children, she said. They need stability. They can't be in the middle of a... I know. He was very direct about it. I know exactly what they need. I've been watching them for 4 months. I know what Noah needs, and I know what Lily needs, and I know what you need. He paused. And what all 3 of you need is exactly what you already have, which is this. She looked at the ground between them. If I stay, she said slowly, It gets harder before it gets easier. Crow isn't finished. No, Cole said. He isn't. And I'm not a person who falls apart, but I'm also not. She pressed her lips together. I'm not easy to be around when I'm scared. I get difficult. I know that too, he said, and then, very quietly, I'm asking you anyway. She looked up at him. In the barn doorway, the rain was softening to something gentler, the Montana sky doing what it sometimes did, breaking apart to show a strip of dark blue between the clouds, stars appearing in a narrow band above the western hills like they'd been waiting for the noise to stop. She had arrived at this gate 5 months ago with mud on her boots and her late husband's ring in her pocket and 2 starving children, and she had told herself she was here to work, just keep her children alive, just earn the next day and the one after that. She had not planned for this man. She had not planned for any of this. Okay, she said. It came out rough and quiet. Cole's hand was still on her shoulder. His thumb moved slightly, once, the smallest possible gesture. Go get dry, he said. The children are going to want to see you. She turned toward the barn door. She stopped. Cole? Yeah. She looked at the packed wagon, the blankets and the tin box and the $23 she'd saved against the possibility of having to run, and then she looked at him. Thank you, she said. For the lawyer. For all of it. He looked at her for a long moment. Go inside, he said. She went inside. Noah was at the kitchen table with Lily, both of them wrapped in a blanket, both of them watching the door with the particular intensity of children who have set a thing in motion and are now waiting to learn whether they did the right thing. Noah's feet were leaving small, wet prints on the floor. Lily's hands were clasped tight on the table. Evelyn stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her children. We're staying, she said. Noah exhaled with his whole small body. Lily unclasped her hands. And outside, through the kitchen window, the last of the storm moved east across the Montana plains, leaving behind a sky that was wider and cleaner than anything had a right to be after that much weather. The engagement announcement did not happen the way Evelyn imagined it would. There was no formal announcement, actually. That was the thing. Cole didn't place a notice in the territorial paper or send letters to neighbors or make any kind of declaration that gave Red Hollow time to prepare its response. What happened instead was that Agnes Barrow saw them together at the dry goods store on a Tuesday morning. Cole's hand at the small of Evelyn's back for approximately 4 seconds while he reached past her for something on a high shelf, the most ordinary gesture in the world, the kind that doesn't happen between an employer and an employee. And Agnes Barrow was a school teacher who had spent her adult life reading rooms for a living, and she understood what she was seeing immediately. By Thursday, Red Hollow knew. By Sunday, it had opinions. The Sunday gathering at the meeting hall, Red Hollow's version of a church service, led by a pastor named Elias Holt, who was, coincidentally and awkwardly, a distant cousin of the feed supplier Cole had dismissed in February, was the first public space where the new situation arranged itself into visible shape. Evelyn had not planned to attend. She had been going most Sundays since March, quietly, sitting near the back with the children, because the alternative was to stay away and confirm every story being told about her, and she had decided early on that she would not give Red Hollow the satisfaction of her absence. This Sunday was different from the moment she walked in. The whispers started before she reached the third pew. Not quiet whispers. The kind with just enough volume to be heard. The kind that were meant to be heard. A woman named Clara Finch's mother, who had apparently decided that the schoolyard version of her campaign needed a more adult venue, leaned toward the woman beside her and said something that contained the words shameless, and that woman's children in close proximity. Evelyn sat down. She put Noah on her left and Lily on her right, and she looked at the front of the room and kept her face exactly where she needed it to be. Lily's jaw was doing the thing. Don't, Evelyn said quietly without looking at her. Lily's jaw stayed where it was, but she didn't say anything out loud, which was the best available outcome. Walter Crow was there, 3 rows ahead, turned slightly sideways in his seat in the way of a man who wants to be seen monitoring a situation without appearing to monitor it. He caught Evelyn's eye for a brief moment and gave her the practiced smile, and she looked past him at the front wall and gave him nothing. The service started. Pastor Holt was a reasonable man in ordinary circumstances. Evelyn had found him decent enough on previous Sundays, the kind of clergyman more interested in the practical welfare of his congregation than in doctrinal performance. But this Sunday, he had an agenda, and the agenda had Crow's fingerprints on it in the particular way that things in Red Hollow had started to have Crow's fingerprints on them. The pastor spoke for 20 minutes on the subject of community standards and the particular vulnerability of the frontier to moral erosion. He never said Evelyn's name. He never said Cole's name. He said recent developments twice, and the sanctity of established order once, and he looked, briefly and seemingly involuntarily, in Evelyn's direction on 3 separate occasions. The room was aware of every look. Evelyn sat very still. When it was over, she stood to go, and she was 3 steps from the door when she heard Walter Crow's voice, louder than a conversation requires, aimed at the man beside him, but calibrated for the room. "A woman who can't maintain her own household comes looking for another man's," Crow said. "Can't say I'm surprised it's ending this way." The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something has crossed a line that people have been waiting to watch get crossed. Evelyn stopped walking. She turned around. Crow was looking at her with the expression of a man who has achieved the thing he was aiming at and is now waiting to see what it costs. She walked back. Not fast, not aggressive, just back, steadily, the way she walked toward everything she intended to deal with directly. She stopped in front of him. "My household," she said, "is in better order than it has been in 3 years. The accounts are clean, the vendor relationships are sound, and the operating income was up in the second quarter for the first time since your friend Darius Holt started billing for feed he wasn't delivering." She held his gaze. "If you have a specific concern about how Blackwood Ranch is being managed, I'll be happy to show you the records. All of them." Crow's expression did a complicated thing. "This isn't about records," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She looked at him for one more moment, then turned to the room. Not theatrically, just turning, because there were people here who had known Cole Bennett for years, and they were watching, and she was done pretending they weren't. "Cole Bennett has run this ranch with integrity for 15 years. He employs 9 men, and their families depend on that employment. He's owed contracts on time and obligations kept, the same as any man in this territory, and what's been happening to those contracts has nothing to do with anything that belongs in this room." She picked up Noah's hand. She nodded to Lily. She walked out. The air outside was warm, early June doing its best, and her hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear, more from the particular physical response to controlled anger, the body doing things independently of the mind's composed presentation. She pressed them flat against her skirt and kept walking. Behind her, from inside the meeting hall, she heard a voice. It was Tom Pratt, 17 years old, from Ohio, who had come to Montana looking for adventure and found mostly mud and hard labor and a kitchen table with a lamp burning over a reading primer. She heard his voice through the open door of the meeting hall saying, loudly enough to reach the back row, "Everything she just said is true. I work the ranch. I've seen the books. Crow's been talking garbage about that operation for months, and I've had enough of it." She stopped walking. She stood on the wooden sidewalk outside with her children's hands in hers, and she listened. There was a murmur from inside. Then a second voice, Dutch, unmistakably, with the patient authority of a man who had been 63 years old for what seemed like several decades. "Boy's right. I've been at that ranch longer than half this town's been incorporated. Cole Bennett is a fair man who was broken for a while and is now less broken. Seems to me that's what you want for your neighbors." Silence from inside. Then a third voice, a woman's, clear and deliberate, Agnes Barrow. "That child is Lily Mercer is the best student in this school, and I will say that in any room I'm asked to, including this one, her mother has conducted herself with more dignity under more provocation than most people in this territory ever face." Evelyn stood on the sidewalk. Noah looked up at her. "Why did you stop walking?" She didn't have an answer that was the right size for a 5-year-old. "I just needed a minute," she said. She started walking again. Cole was at the ranch when they got back, working on the east fence line repair he'd been putting off for 2 weeks. He came in at midday with dirt on his hands and a piece of fence wire still hooked in his belt loop, and found Evelyn at the kitchen table with a look on her face that he had learned to read as something happened, and I handled it, but I'm still running slightly hot. "Sunday service," he said. "Sunday service," she confirmed. He sat down. She told him plainly, without editorializing, what Crow had said and what she had said back and what Tom and Dutch and Agnes had said after. Cole was very quiet through most of it. When she finished, he looked at the table for a moment. I should have been there. I handled it. I know you handled it. He looked up. I should have been there anyway. Beside you. Not letting you walk into that room by yourself every week while I... He stopped. While I kept finding reasons the fence line needed work on Sunday mornings. She looked at him. You've been avoiding it, she said. Not as an accusation, just as an observation, the way she made most observations. Precisely and without decoration. Yes, he said. I have. He said it flatly, owning it without excuses. I kept telling myself I was picking the fights worth picking, but I was also letting you be the one standing in the room while people said things about you that I should have been there to answer for. I don't need... Evelyn. He looked at her with that directness that still, after 4 months, had the capacity to stop her mid-sentence. I'm not saying you can't handle yourself. I'm saying I should have been beside you. That's different. She held his gaze. She had been the person standing alone in every room for a long time. She had gotten very good at it. She was not entirely sure what to do with a man who wanted to change that. Okay, she said. Next Sunday, he said. I'll be there. Crow won't like it. Crow can go to hell, Cole said, with the complete absence of drama that made it the most convincing thing she'd heard all week. He went to wash his hands. He came back and ate lunch and then sat across from her in the ranch office while she worked through the afternoon accounts. And they didn't talk much, but the room had a different quality to it than it had had that morning. Solider somehow, more settled, the way a structure feels after a repair rather than before. The letter from the Helena lawyer arrived 4 days later. Marcus Webb was the lawyer's name, and his letter was 3 pages long and written in the careful, specific language of a man who charged by the competence rather than the word count. The Hendricks claim, he wrote, had significant procedural weaknesses. Wyoming territorial inheritance law did not support the specific recovery avenue Hendricks was pursuing, and the original debt settlements Evelyn had executed, which she had documented meticulously because she documented everything meticulously, had language that effectively closed the door on secondary claims. Webb's recommendation was a formal response letter, which he would draft, followed by a quiet period to see whether Hendricks had the stomach to proceed against a properly defended position. His estimate of the cost was reasonable. His estimate of the outcome was cautious, but not pessimistic. Evelyn read the letter twice. She went and found Cole in the barn. She handed him the letter without saying anything. He read it. He looked up. Good news, he said. Relatively, she said. Better than the alternative. Yes. She took the letter back. She stood for a moment, looking at it, and then she said, I've been carrying this for 4 months. The letter, the claim, the possibility that I was going to walk into this arrangement and leave a legal mess behind me. I know. I should have told you sooner. You should have, he agreed. He wasn't harsh about it. But you had reasons. Bad ones. Human ones, he said. There's a difference. She folded the letter. She looked at him. Cole, she said, I need to ask you something. He waited. What are we doing? She said. It came out more directly than she'd planned, which was how her questions usually arrived when she'd been holding them too long. Not the ranch, not the accounts. I need to know what you think we're doing because I have 2 children watching everything that happens in this house. And I can't... She stopped. I'm not able to manage the uncertainty anymore. I need to know what this is. Cole looked at her for a long moment. He had an expression she hadn't seen before. Not the guarded stillness, not the complicated internal things she'd been trying to read for months, but something more open than either, the face of a man who has decided to stop being careful. I think you know what this is, he said. I need you to say it. He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, and he took her face in both hands. His palms rough and calloused and warm. And he looked at her directly and said, I want you to stay. Not as an employee, not because the accounts need you, because I need you. He paused. Because I need you and those kids, and I'm done pretending I don't. She looked at him. Her hands had come up and were holding his wrists without her quite deciding to do that. This is going to be complicated, she said. It already is. Crow isn't finished. Neither are we. She stood there in the middle of his barn with her dead husband's ring in her coat pocket, and 4 months of accumulated feeling pressing against the inside of her chest. And she thought about mud and frozen gates, and a man carrying her son through a doorway, and a clay pot of honey and ginger in a dark hallway, and Tuesday wildflowers in a tin cup. And she thought about a 7-year-old girl eating lunch alone, and a 5-year-old boy running barefoot through the rain to wake a man who needed waking. "Okay," she said. "Okay, what?" "Okay," she said. "Yes, I'll stay. Not as an employee." Cole looked at her for a moment. Something crossed his face that was not complicated at all. Simple, clean, the expression of a man who has been waiting for something to stop hurting and feels it stop. He kissed her, not dramatically. Carefully, the way you do something you've been waiting a long time to do right. She kissed him back with 4 months of held breath behind it, and the barn around them was ordinary and smelled like horses and hay, and the particular combination of wood and earth that meant Montana in early summer, and it was nothing like anything Evelyn would have described as a moment before it happened, which was exactly what made it real. When they separated, she was looking slightly to the left of his face, which was what she did when she was recalibrating. "The children," she said, they'll be fine. Noah is going to tell everyone. "He's going to tell Dutch first," Cole said. "Dutch will tell everyone, probably before dinner." She made a sound that was a laugh despite the circumstances. He was right, as it turned out. Dutch knew by 5 o'clock. By breakfast the next morning, Tom Pratt had shaken Cole's hand with the solemn enthusiasm of a 17-year-old attending his first significant event, and Arlo had nodded once in Evelyn's direction with the satisfied expression of a man whose private analysis had been confirmed. The town of Red Hollow learned about the engagement at the following Sunday gathering. Cole was there. He had been there the previous Sunday as promised, standing beside her during the service in a way that communicated something no one in the room could misread. This Sunday he stood beside her again, and after the service, when Pastor Holt was shaking hands at the door, Cole told him directly and without preamble that he intended to marry Evelyn Mercer, and he wanted the pastor to know from him personally before he heard it elsewhere. Elias Holt, to his credit, looked at Cole for a long moment, and then looked at Evelyn and said, "She strikes me as someone who knows what she's about." "She is," Cole said. "Then I'll say congratulations and mean it," Holt said. He shook Cole's hand. He nodded to Evelyn. Crow was in the yard outside. He heard. She could see from the slight change in his posture that he heard, and that he was calculating, rapidly, and without the practiced smile for once, what this changed in his position. It changed quite a lot. A widow employed at a man's ranch was a manageable social problem. Scandalous in a low-grade, sustainable way that could be maintained indefinitely with the right application of town opinion. A woman engaged to marry that man was a different matter entirely. The legal and social architecture shifted. The things that had been fuel for Crow's campaign suddenly had a different shape in a community that, whatever its flaws, understood the formal weight of a marriage announcement. Crow knew this. She could see him knowing it. He looked at her across the yard. She looked back at him. She did not smile. She did not perform anything. She just held his gaze with the same directness she brought to ledger columns and vendor contracts. Clear-eyed, precise, entirely willing to sit with the discomfort of the thing until the other party looked away. Crow looked away first. It was a small thing. It was a very specific thing. She filed it. But small victories had a way of arriving before the larger situation resolved, and the larger situation had not resolved. Crow was not a man who accepted losing quietly, and the days following the announcement made that clear. 2 ranch hands received visits from men they owed money to, men whose loans had recently been acquired by a holding company that, Evelyn noted when she looked into it, had a silent partner in the Red Hollow banking community. 3 of Cole's regular vendors sent letters citing price increases effective immediately. A water rights issue on the northern pasture that had been dormant for 2 years suddenly had a formal challenge filed against it, the filing date suspiciously proximate to the engagement announcement. Evelyn documented everything. She worked through 2 nights without proper sleep, which Cole knew and did not like, and on the second night he came downstairs at 1 in the morning and stood in the ranch office doorway and looked at her with that expression. "Come to bed," he said. "In an hour." Evelyn. "The water rights filing has a procedural problem in how it was submitted," she said. If I document it tonight, I can get the paperwork to Webb and Helena by the end of the week, and he can file a counter-objection before the review period closes. She looked up. 1 hour. He looked at her for a moment. Then he went to the kitchen and came back with coffee and sat down across from her and pulled the vendor letters toward him. "Show me what you're looking for," he said. She showed him. They worked until 2:30 in the morning. Cole caught 2 errors in the water rights submission that Evelyn had missed because she'd been on the same document too long, and her eyes had stopped seeing it fresh. She caught a pattern in the vendor letters that clarified which ones had been genuinely initiated and which had been pressured. A small difference in phrasing that pointed toward a single source. "He's overextended," she said, looking at the spread of papers between them. "This is too many moves at once. He's reacting to the engagement, to losing control of the situation. He spent months building a campaign based on ambiguity. What you and I were, what the arrangement meant, whether it was scandalous or just unconventional. The engagement removes the ambiguity." She set down her pen. "He doesn't have a slow play anymore, so he's going fast. And fast is where people make mistakes." Cole looked at the papers. "You've been thinking about this a long time. Since the hardware store," she said. "When Tom told us what Crow said." She paused. "I've been waiting to see what he did when he felt cornered. And now we know. Now we know." She gathered the papers into their proper order. "Get Webb to file the counter-objection. Address the vendor price increases by sourcing alternatives. I have 3 suppliers in Helena and Billings who aren't in Crow's network that I've been building relationships with for 2 months. And the hands with debt pressure, I'll cover those debts," Cole said. "Pull them out from under it." "That's expensive." "It's my men," he said. It wasn't complicated for him. "They work my ranch. I'm not leaving them exposed because of my situation." She looked at him. "That's the kind of thing," she said carefully, "that a town notices. When a man stands behind his people like that." Cole shrugged. "I'm not doing it for the town." "I know," she said, "but the town is going to notice anyway." She was right. Red Hollow noticed. People talked about the thing Crow had tried to do to the ranch hands and the thing Cole had done in response, and the story had a moral shape that was hard to argue with, and some people who had been listening to Crow found themselves quietly revising their position. The revision was slow. It was incomplete. It happened the way most things happen in small frontier towns. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in individual, private moments of reconsideration that accumulated gradually into a shift in the room's temperature. But it happened, and Walter Crow, sitting in his bank with a set of overextended moves and a campaign that had lost its ambiguity, was starting to understand what Evelyn had understood 3 weeks ago, that he had miscalculated. That the woman he had decided to treat as a temporary inconvenience had turned out to be something else entirely. She had not needed rescuing when she arrived. She had never needed rescuing. What she had needed was a gate that opened. And everything since then had been the shape of what happens when a person with that kind of capability finds solid ground under their feet. Marcus Webb's counter-objection on the water rights filing landed in the Territorial Review Office on a Friday, 3 days before the challenge period closed. Webb was thorough in the way of lawyers who take professional pride seriously. The kind of thorough that finds procedural errors not because it's looking for technicalities, but because it reads documents the way they were meant to be read, completely and without assumptions. The original filing against Cole's Northern Pasture water rights had been submitted under a provision that required the challenging party to demonstrate direct and current usage conflict. What Crow's associate had filed instead demonstrated historical proximity, which was a different thing entirely and not sufficient grounds under territorial law. Webb's response made that distinction with the polite, unhurried precision of a man who knows the room and knows the other party knows he knows it. The challenge was dismissed within the week. Evelyn read the notification letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with her coffee going cold beside her, and she read it twice the way she read everything important. And then she set it on the table and looked out the window at the south garden, where the tomatoes were coming in heavy on the vine, and the beans were ready to pick. And in the far corner, slightly ragged but unmistakably alive, 2 rows of sunflowers had grown to the height of her shoulder. She sat with it for a moment. Not triumph exactly. More like the quiet that comes after a sustained effort finally finds its resolution. The particular stillness of a problem that has been carried for so long that putting it down changes the way you stand. She took the letter to Cole in the barn. He read it. He looked up. Done, he said. Done, she said. He handed the letter back. He went back to what he was doing, which was repairing a bridle with the focused attention he brought to physical work. She stood in the barn doorway and watched him for a moment and thought about all the ways things could have gone differently. The Cheyenne letter, the water rights challenge, the vendor pressure, the Sunday mornings in the meeting hall, and she thought about how none of it had been clean or simple or resolved the way things resolve in stories, all at once with clear lines. It had been incremental, grinding, one document, one conversation, one person at a time. That was the part nobody told you about survival. It didn't feel like surviving while you were doing it. It felt like bookkeeping. The thing with Crow broke open not because of the water rights dismissal or the vendor situation or any of the legal maneuvering, but because of Arlo. Arlo Briggs had been the quietest man at the ranch for 6 months, present at the reading sessions, competent with the accounts work Evelyn had been teaching him, reliable in the way of men who don't make promises they can't keep and don't make noise about the ones they do. He had grown up in Red Hollow, which none of the other hands had. He had history in this town, family, here, which meant he had been watching Crow's operation from a closer angle than anyone else on the ranch, and had been carrying what he knew with the particular caution of someone who understands that in a small town, what you say and who you say it to has consequences that follow you home. He came to Evelyn on a Wednesday afternoon in late June and sat down across from her in the ranch office and put his hat on his knee and said, "I need to tell you something." She set down her pen. "Okay. Crow's been holding paper on 4 families in this county that have daughters working age," Arlo said. He said it carefully, the way you say something you've been building up to for a while. "He holds their loans. He's used that twice that I know of to influence who those families do business with and how they talk about people Crow once talked about a certain way." He paused. "My sister's family is one of the 4. Evelyn was still. "That's how the campaign against you spread so fast," he said. "It wasn't all genuine opinion. Some of it was people who couldn't afford not to go along." She looked at him. "Your sister? She doesn't like what she's been saying." He looked at his hat. "She told me last week she was ashamed of it. They've got 3 kids and the loan comes due in September, and she was scared." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. "Does Cole know any of this?" she asked. "No. How many people know the full shape of it?" "Me?" Arlo said. "And now you." She picked up her pen. She set it down again. She looked at the window and thought about the specific kind of ugliness that uses financial fear as a social weapon, the way Crow had built his influence not through genuine authority, but through leverage, the slow, patient accumulation of other people's debts turned into tools of control. It was not a new story. It was one of the oldest stories there was, wearing frontier clothes. "What do you want to do with this?" she said. Arlo looked up. "I want it to stop," he said. It was simple when he said it, the uncomplicated want of a man who had watched his sister be ashamed of herself for months. "I don't know how." "I do," Evelyn said. She spent that evening with Cole going through everything Arlo had told her, laying it out methodically the way she laid out accounts. This entry, this figure, this is what it means when you see it next to this other figure. Cole listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about him she had come to rely on without fully realizing when it had started. When she finished, he said, "How do we use it?" "Carefully," she said. "If we go at Crow directly, he digs in. He has enough legitimate community standing that a direct attack looks like a vendetta." She turned her pen in her hand. "But if the families he's been pressuring understand that his leverage depends on them not knowing each other, if they know they're not alone in this, his position changes. You want to talk to them. I want Arlo to talk to them," she said. "He's from here. He knows these people. They'll hear it differently from him than from us." She paused. "And I want Marcus Webb to look at how those loans are structured. If Crow has been using the terms to apply pressure that wasn't written into the contracts, that's actionable." Cole looked at her. "You've been thinking about this," he said. "Since Arlo sat down in the office," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "You know what you are," he said. "What?" "Dangerous," he said. "To people who try to use paper and fear as weapons against people who can't read the paper." She looked at him steadily. I grew up poor enough to understand what it feels like to be at the end of someone else's leverage. I don't have a lot of patience for it. Cole nodded once. Tell Arlo to start talking. Arlo started talking. It took 3 weeks. He went family by family, quietly, in the evenings, with the patience of a man who understood that trust in a small community is rebuilt the same way it's destroyed, one conversation at a time. He told his sister first. He told her about the other families. He told her that what Crow had been doing was not something she had caused or deserved, that the shame she'd been carrying belonged to a man who had engineered the situation, not to the people he'd put in it. His sister cried. She was angry. She asked what could be done. Arlo told her. Marcus Webb's review of the loan structures took 2 weeks and produced an 11-page letter that used the phrase improper influence 4 times and breach of fiduciary conduct twice, written in the measured language of a lawyer who was being deliberately careful to say exactly what he meant and nothing more, because exactly what he meant was already significant enough. The letter went to the Territorial Banking Commissioner's office in Helena. Crow did not know about the letter until it had already arrived. The first sign that something had shifted came on a Sunday in mid-July, which was the Sunday that Evelyn and Cole walked into the weekly gathering and found that the seating arrangement was different. Not dramatically. Nobody had reorganized furniture or made declarations. But the space that had been quietly maintained around Evelyn for months, the slight physical margin that social disapproval creates without anyone consciously deciding to create it, was smaller. Margaret Hollis, of the dry goods store, nodded to her when she came in, nodded specifically with eye contact, which was something that had not happened since February. Clara Finch's mother looked at her hands when Evelyn walked past. Small things. The kind of small things that are actually large things when you've been counting them in the other direction for 6 months. Lily noticed immediately. She was 7 years old, and she had been cataloging the temperature of every room she walked into since before she could fully articulate why, and she reached up and took Evelyn's hand as they sat down and squeezed once without looking at her, which meant, I see it too. Evelyn squeezed back. Crow was not there that Sunday. He had been at every gathering for as long as anyone could remember. His absence was its own statement, and the room understood it. The wedding was set for the last Saturday of July. It was not a large production, partly because Evelyn did not want a large production, and partly because Cole would have been willing to go to the magistrate's office in Red Hollow on a Tuesday morning if that was what she preferred, which it was not. But the point was that they agreed on something simple and honest rather than something performed. Agnes Barrow organized the women of the ranch, which consisted of herself, Evelyn, Lily, and the wives of 2 ranch hands who had driven in from their small homesteads 20 miles out, and they spent a Friday evening turning the yard of Blackwood Ranch into something that was not exactly formal, but was unmistakably intentional. Paper lanterns Cole had sent away from a catalog. Long tables made from sawhorses and planking and covered with white cloth that Agnes had pressed herself. Wildflowers from the surrounding hills in tin cups. The same tin cup from the kitchen windowsill, and many others like it, arranged down the center of every table. Dutch spent most of Friday helping and complaining about both activities with equal energy. Tom Pratt did whatever he was pointed at with 17-year-old earnestness. Arlo worked quietly and efficiently, the way he did everything, and at one point caught Evelyn's eye across the yard and gave her the small nod of a man who has done a thing he is privately satisfied about. She nodded back. The morning of the wedding, Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed. Still her room, the room she'd been given that first night, though that designation was about to change. And she held James's silver ring in her palm. She sat with it for a while. She had been sitting with grief and love and the complicated space between them for 2 years, and she had made a kind of peace with the fact that both things could exist at the same time without canceling each other out. Grief was not a debt you paid off. It was a thing you carried differently as time passed. Heavier in some moments, lighter in others, never gone but changing shape. James had loved her. He had also kept things from her that damaged her life. Both were true. He had been a good father. He had been a flawed man. He had left her alone in a situation he had made harder than it needed to be, and she had survived it, and she had arrived, muddy and exhausted, at a gate that had opened. She didn't think she owed him an apology for what came after. She didn't think she owed herself one either. She put the ring in the small cedar box on the dresser, not thrown away, not buried, just placed where it belonged, part of the history that had made her who she was. Then she stood up and put on the white dress Agnes had helped her finish sewing the previous week, which was not elaborate but fit well and was the cleanest thing she'd worn in longer than she cared to calculate. Lily appeared in the doorway. She was wearing the blue dress that Agnes had also quietly produced from somewhere, and her dark hair was combed with unusual smoothness, and she looked at her mother with those serious eyes and said, "You look right." Evelyn looked at her daughter. "Right how?" "Like yourself," Lily said. "But the version that isn't scared." Evelyn stood for a moment in the room where she had spent a year's worth of Tuesday mornings, and Tuesdays had taught her that the smallest gestures were the ones that lasted. "Come here," she said. Lily came to her and she held her daughter for a moment in the clean morning light and thought about all the rooms they had stood in together that were difficult rooms and how Lily had stood in every one of them with her jaw set and her hands flat on the table and her father's eyes taking the careful measure of things. And what a remarkable thing it was to have been trusted with someone like this. "I love you," she said. "I know," Lily said, in the brisk way she accepted things that were simply true. Then, "Noah is already outside and he has dirt on his good shirt." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. "Of course he does," she said. The ceremony itself was short, conducted by Pastor Elias Holt, who had come with a genuine expression and the careful demeanor of a man who had thought about the previous months and reached his own private conclusions about what his behavior had and hadn't been. He shook Cole's hand before they started and said quietly, "I should have said more plainly, sooner, that what was happening to your family wasn't right. It was not a full accounting, but it was an honest one, and Cole accepted it the way he accepted most things, directly, without excess. The yard was full, not the whole town. Red Hollow was still Red Hollow, and there were people who stayed home on principle, and that was their right. But enough people that the tables were full, and the evening had a specific warmth to it, the warmth of people who have chosen to be somewhere because they want to be there rather than because social expectation required it. Dutch cried during the vows and then denied it to anyone who brought it up for the rest of the evening and arguably the rest of his life. Tom Pratt made a toast that was sincere and slightly too long and contained 2 grammatical errors that he would have caught 6 months ago at the reading table, which Evelyn noticed and which made the whole thing more perfect than a polished toast would have been. Arlo's sister was there. She came with her husband and sat near the back and watched the whole thing with the expression of a woman still in the process of deciding how to feel about herself, which was honest and appropriate and not something she needed to resolve tonight. Agnes Barrow drank 2 glasses of cider and told Lily she had recommended her for the advanced reading program in Billings, which Lily received with an expression of focused, barely contained excitement that was the most unsuppressed Evelyn had ever seen her. Cole stood beside Evelyn for most of the evening, not performing couplehood, just present, refilling her glass when it was empty, resting his hand briefly on her shoulder when someone said something that required more patience than it deserved, answering questions about the ranch with the directness of a man who had stopped organizing his answers around other people's comfort. He was not a transformed man. He was the same man, with the same quietness, the same controlled expressions, the same tendency to process things internally before he spoke. But something in the chronic tension that had lived in his jaw for years had eased, and the ease was visible to anyone who had known him before. At some point in the late evening, when the tables had been pushed aside and some of the hands had produced instruments from somewhere, and the yard had taken on the loose, warm quality of people who had stopped keeping track of the time, Noah appeared at Evelyn's side. He had, in fact, had dirt on his good shirt. It had been addressed. The shirt now had a faint ghost of the dirt rather than the dirt itself, which was the best available outcome. He leaned against her and looked out at the yard. The lanterns, the music. Dutch currently attempting to teach Agnes Barrow a dance she had strong opinions about. The ranch in summer dark, with the Montana stars very large above the cottonwood trees. "Mama," he said. Are we going to stay now?" He said it without anxiety. Just checking, the way he checked that the horses were in before a storm, practical and forward-looking. "For always?" She looked down at him. Then out at the yard. At Lily, sitting with Agnes, listening to something with that focused look. At Cole across the yard, talking to Roy Harker, who had come after all, standing with the slightly uncomfortable posture of a man making amends through presence rather than words. At the garden along the south wall, invisible now in the dark, but there, the tomatoes, the beans, the 2 rows of sunflowers that had no business surviving and had survived anyway. "For always," she said. Noah nodded with satisfaction. He went back to wherever he had been doing whatever 7-year-olds do at their mother's wedding, which probably involved something she'd find out about tomorrow. She stood in the yard of Blackwood Ranch with the music behind her and the summer dark around her, and she thought about a frozen gate in February and a man who had seen her children before he'd finished hearing her name. She thought about ledger columns and wildflowers on Tuesday mornings and a clay pot of honey and ginger in a dark hallway. She thought about a staircase and a packed wagon and rain on a barn roof and a 5-year-old boy with the moral clarity to do the thing that needed doing. She thought about what her daughter had said this morning, the version that isn't scared. She was not entirely unscared. That would be a lie, and she did not have much patience for convenient lies. There was still Hendricks and his claim in Cheyenne, still the slow work of rebuilding trust with a community that had been turned against her, still the fundamental uncertainty of a life that had already demonstrated several times over that certainty was not something the world was obligated to provide. But there was a difference between fear and the kind of fear that makes you pack a wagon in the dark and try to disappear before anyone can see you go. She had been the second kind for a long time. She had learned, in this house, in this difficult and particular year, how to be the first kind instead, the kind that sees the thing clearly and stays anyway. That was what love did, she thought. Not the version in stories where it arrived and solved things. The actual version, the human version, which showed up in clay pots and contract clauses, and a man who said the right question is whether I'm willing to go back to being the man I was before she got here. The version that did not resolve your problems but gave you someone to work them through with, at a kitchen table, at 1 a.m, with the lamp burning low between you. The version that changed what you were willing to carry. Cole came back across the yard and stood beside her. He had a look on his face that she had learned to read accurately by now. Quiet, present, not performing anything. "Roy apologized," he said. "I know, I saw. He means it." "I think he does," she said. "He's a practical man. Practical people apologize when the practical analysis requires it." Cole looked at her sideways. "Is that what you think apologizing is?" "Sometimes," she said. "What's the other kind?" She thought about it. The kind where the analysis has nothing to do with it. He was quiet for a moment, then, "I'm sorry I avoided the Sunday service for 2 months." She looked at him. "That's the second kind," he said. She looked out at the yard, at the lanterns and the music and Dutch's continued struggles with the dance. "Yes," she said, "it is." He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into it slightly, not dramatically, just the small physical acknowledgement of a person accepting that something solid is there. They stood together for a while and watched the evening. Blackwood Ranch was not a perfect place. It had been too quiet for too long and had the permanent shadow of grief in its older corners, the places where a woman named Margaret had tended the garden and a small girl had left her marks on door frames and window ledges. Those shadows did not disappear because something good had happened. They did not disappear at all. What happened instead was that they were joined by other things, by reading primers on a kitchen table and a 5-year-old's muddy boot prints on the floor and a teenager's too long toast and a woman's handwriting in the ledger margins, building a new layer of life over the old without erasing it. That was the thing about a house that had survived grief. It knew how to hold more than one thing at a time. Somewhere in the field beyond the cottonwoods, Noah had found fireflies. Or they had found him, it was hard to say which. And he was running through the summer dark with his arms out and his shirt untucked, and that face he made when the world was providing exactly the kind of thing he was in the market for. Lily stood at the edge of the lantern light watching him with the particular expression of an older sister who finds a sibling ridiculous and is glad of them anyway. Evelyn watched her children in the dark of the Montana summer and felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled in a long time. Not happiness exactly, though happiness was in it somewhere. More like the deep, unglamorous relief of a person who has been holding their breath for a year and a half and has finally, in a yard full of imperfect people making imperfect music under improbably large stars, let it out. She had arrived here with mud on her boots, and 2 starving children, and the last silver ring her dead husband left behind. She had arrived without a plan beyond the next day and the one after that. She had arrived to beg a stranger's mercy and had been met instead by a man who saw her children first. What she had built since then was not a rescue story. She wanted to be clear about that, even in the privacy of her own thinking, because the rescue story was the one people would tell, and it was not the accurate one. She had not been saved. She had been given space, a gate that opened, a desk with ledgers on it, a kitchen table with a lamp. And she had done the work. The same work she had always done, with the same precision, the same forward motion, the same refusal to let fear write the ending. What was different was that she had done it with someone. That turned out to matter more than she had let herself believe it would. The music shifted to something slower. Dutch had apparently conceded the dance lesson. The lanterns moved in the light summer wind. Cole's arm stayed where it was. In the morning, there would be accounts to review and vendors to contact, and the ongoing project of managing a large cattle operation through the complex terrain of frontier commerce. There would be Lily's education and Noah's inexhaustible energy, and the sunflowers along the south wall that would need attention before first frost. There would be Crow, diminished but not finished, licking the wounds of a campaign that had failed to land where he'd aimed it. There would be the slow, uneven work of a community rebuilding trust with itself, which was never a clean process and had no certain timeline. There would be all of it. But tonight the ranch was lit with paper lanterns and the smell of summer grass, and somewhere in the dark field beyond the cottonwoods, a 5-year-old boy was chasing fireflies with the total conviction that this was exactly what the night required. And Evelyn Mercer. Evelyn Bennett, now, though she would keep Mercer in her name the way you keep anything that made you who you are, stood in the yard she had nearly left twice and felt the ground solid under her feet. For a woman who had walked through frozen mud 6 months ago with nothing but 2 children and a ring and the absolute unwillingness to stop moving, that was enough. That was everything.